welcome back to Let's Read Darksiders, the Abomination Vault, by Ari Marmel. I'm BurningDogFace, and it's been a while since the last one of these, and, I'd wanted to come back for a while now. So, before I get started, shout out to Derek Dement, who left a comment that kind of kicked me into action the other day, saying, "Please do Chapter 6+. Your voice matches the story better than my own imagination. I was sad to notice you've only done 5 chapters. Well, Derek, this one's for you." Chapter 6. It had been difficult, at first, to tell that he'd crossed between worlds at all. The biting, predatory chill, the gusts so cold they nearly congealed into a solid mass, the flurries of swirling snow. All were as much a part of where he had gone as where he'd been. But where the snows of Kothysos were thick, sludgy, discolored by waste and corruption, these were pure, as white as angels' wings. Here was not the sapping cold of the blizzard, but the raw sharpness of the highest peaks. Death and despair had emerged from the emptiness between worlds at the very edges of the Crowfather's domain. The ancient hermit's eldritch defenses would allow nobody, not even the horseman, to materialize any nearer. From there, under clouded skies as gray as any headstone, rider and mount had traveled the meandering canyons of jagged rock that ran beside the mountain's roots. For long hours, despair had galloped tirelessly, carving hoofprints into the cracked, icy surface. Slowly, a thickening of the grim overcast began to suggest the fall of twilight. Except, Death realized almost instantly, what he saw wasn't twilight at all. The heavens ahead were not darkened, but obscured. Spreading in all directions like an oily stain came a roiling mass, blacker and heavier than any storm. Crows. Uncountable, perhaps infinite crows. And not merely these, the Crowfather's chosen, but multiple pillars of twisting smoke choked the skies as well. Even from such a distance, the occasional sharp crash or ringing clatter of battle wafted over the open ground. Flashes of searing light silhouetted the swooping flocks, or the occasional gleaming figure both down in the canyon and up atop the towering ridgeline. The horseman ordered dust into the air, though he knew that the snow and the sheer population of those skies might prevent his companion from observing much of use. He and despair had then charged headlong for the base of the nearest cliff. It was clear immediately that the mount could go no further. Continuing along the canyon floor would have been asking to be spotted by the dozens of constructs atop the mountain ledges. Death would have to proceed on higher ground, yet the looping switchbacks, narrow shelves, and perilous climbs could not possibly provide purchase for hooves, no matter how dexterous or unnatural. Harvester strapped to his back by a leather baldric that hadn't been present only moments before, Death had slid from the saddle and begun his ascent. Although the peaks and ledges were crawling with the metal soldiers, their spinning supports providing uncanny balance, Death had faced little opposition during his ascent. He came across several fallen constructs wedged into crannies in the rock, their brass and stone carapaces marred by scores of scratches, small yet deep. The crows descended upon the invaders, and the power of the Crowfather bestowed their talons and beaks with more than enough strength to wound the unliving invaders. The birds themselves, despite their numbers, could never have defended the domain alone, but they were far from their master's only defenses. Seemingly mild breezes abruptly froze attackers solid, or gusted violently enough to hurl them over nearby precipices. The air sizzled and cracked as bolts of lightning gouged the cloudless skies, somehow missing the massed crows to obliterate throngs of constructs. Rock faces that had stood unyielding for millennia crumbled at the worst possible time, burying invaders by the dozens. Fire erupted from the deepest caves. The Crowfather's mastery of his domain was nigh absolute, and for a time it appeared that Death's presence would prove superfluous. As he progressed across the cliffs, however, the quantity of brass soldiers didn't seem substantially reduced. The horsemen began to wonder just how anyone could have assembled such an enormous host of construct soldiers. It should have taken centuries, and surely the Charred Council would have become aware at some point. Slowly but steadily, Death had neared the Crowfather's abode, ducking low in the mountain passes and sheltering behind outcroppings to avoid numerous battles he could almost certainly have won, but which would have caused unnecessary delay. Unfortunately, he'd finally come across a band of the enemy that he could not easily avoid. Death found himself clinging like an oversized spider to the underside of a jagged stone spur, a slanted outcropping on which half a dozen of the automatons perched, hanging above a drop deep enough to have been the gullet of the world itself. Below were only drifting clouds and a cracked canyon floor so far away it was all but invisible unless the light and the overcast collaborated just so. Fingers and the toes of his boots jammed into any available crevice, clutching with a tireless strength, Death chose to stop peering down at a drop that might just kill even him, should he fumble but once. Atop that thick protrusion, several of the four-armed constructs circled in perfect military formation, brass hands formed into long blades and heavy bludgeons. The spindles on which they balanced whirred, cutting thin paths into the snow and layers of guano that coated the rock. Although they, like their stone brethren, were headless, the slow back-and-forth rotation of their torsos suggested a methodical patrol. The horsemen had hoped to sidle along the cliff face and pass beneath them, continuing on unnoticed, but the contours of the terrain now thwarted his plans. Up ahead, the canyon opened further, providing a clear line of sight to distant ledges occupied by yet more of the stone and metal men. They would spot him easily enough once he emerged from the shadow of the overhang, and while Death didn't believe they had pistols or cannons, he didn't know what means they had of communicating with one another. If they were to alert their compatriots on the spur overhead, they might have some means of attacking over the edge from above, and Death could find himself too busy hugging the stone to fight them off. Better, then, to abandon stealth and take them before they could pose a threat. He tried to listen to the creatures moving above, but the gusting winds, the deafening cries of 1,000 avian throats, and the thickness of the stone itself made a mockery of his efforts. That the enemy was watching, he had no doubt, but precisely where or in what number he just couldn't say. So be it. Death had a very simple doctrine for just such a circumstance. When in doubt, strike first and kill everyone. Scuttling sideways until he reached the edge of the protruding stone, the horseman reached his left arm upward. He felt about until his questing fingers found a crevice on the spur's side that would hold his weight, sank his fingers as deep as they would go, and let go with his other hand and both feet. For an instant, he dangled, his fingertip grip all that kept him from a dreadful plummet. Then, with a single flex, he hauled himself up until he could reach the fingers of his right hand up and over the stone. With one last exertion, he brought his left hand up again, so that he hung from the top of the outcropping, and lifted until he could just see over the edge. He found himself staring at a veritable thicket of brass spindles. One of the automatons was almost directly before him, and it was a stroke of fortune that its attentions were currently directed elsewhere. Numerous others, well over half a dozen, stood at intervals in both directions. Even if Death could hold them off, with their sheer numbers and the limited breadth of the ledge, they could easily bottle him up for a good while. All the more reason to deal with them swiftly, then. Again, Death let go with his right hand, hanging solely by the left. Harvester tugged itself from his back, the strap vanishing, and flew to his waiting fist. At the whim of its wielder, the potent weapon altered itself once more. Not any dramatic change of shape this time, but simply a dulling of the blade, transforming itself into more of a heavy hook than a scythe. The horseman hauled himself up to the edge on his left arm, swung Harvester in a high arc, and yanked with all his strength. The blade sank into the torso of the nearest construct, screeching like the newly damned as metal grated on metal. Rather than slicing through, Harvester instead jerked the brass-coated soldier over backward. For a split second it only wobbled. That spinning base provided an unnatural degree of balance. And then it toppled. The headless shoulders struck with a deafening clang, bouncing once or twice off the unyielding stone. In that same sharp tug, Death sent himself sailing up and over the edge of the outcropping. He didn't fly high, propelled as he was with only the strength of one arm, but he didn't need much height. He tucked his legs under him as he rose, and then thrust down hard in a full-bodied leap. His boots struck the torso of the construct he'd just brought down, hard enough to dent the carapace. The horseman shot overhead, well beyond the reach of the enemy's longest weapons, somersaulting forward as he soared. Harvester's edge sharpened instantly, and the weapon sprouted a second blade on the opposite end of the haft, becoming, in effect, an elongated S with a perfectly straight center line. The force of the impact was also more than sufficient to send the fallen construct flipping end over end off the edge and down, down, until it was lost from sight, but Death had already forgotten about it. He was spinning as he landed, knees bent to absorb the shock, Harvester whirling around him, blades circling in a deadly orbit. Again metal shrieked and shredded, and the 5 nearest constructs, only just turning to the attack, collapsed to the stone in a scattered collection of parts. Only 2 of the squad remained. 2 that should hardly have been a problem, where the prior 6 were not. But for all his acumen, Death had never seen these things in battle, had only their clumsier 6-limbed compatriots by which to judge, and he badly underestimated just how quickly they could move. By the time Death had come out of his spin, Harvester raised. The remaining pair were already upon him. The bits and scraps of their fallen allies proved no impediment at all. The whirring spindles dodged past the bulk of them without the slightest hesitation, and even launched the constructs in surprising leaps over the worst of the detritus. It was a peculiar hopping motion, almost silly-looking, but startlingly effective. They advanced together, synchronized as though guided by a single mind, each swinging all 4 of its hand blades in one violent flurry. They rushed in, leaned in to the attack. Death was more than swift enough to parry the array of blades with a haft of Harvester, but there was nothing he could do to mitigate the sheer momentum of the attack. The impact lifted him off his feet and drove him up and out. Clear of the ledge, suspended for an eternal instant over the shattering drop, and then gravity began hauling at him with avaricious hands. Before his knees had fallen below the level of the rocky surface, the extra head on Harvester flipped itself around, so that both blades now pointed in the same direction. As the topmost blade passed the pitted sides of the thick spur, Death sank it deep into the stone, far deeper than any natural blade could have pierced. He loosened his grip, allowing his own fall to continue, even as Harvester stuck fast, until his hands had almost reached the second blade. Then he clamped down and simultaneously kicked his legs out in front of him. The blade slid through its niche in the stone, serving as a pivot, and Death was swinging forward beneath the jutting finger of rock. A fearsome yank both dislodged the first blade and sank the second one into the opposite side of the overhang. Kicking out once more and curling his arms, he knifed his body upward at an angle that none but the most agile of angels could have duplicated. He released his grip on Harvester, which remained dangling from the rock, tucked into a backward roll, and landed on a crouch back on the outcropping, behind his attackers. Again they rotated to face him with blinding speed, but this time he was ready for them. Rather than try to block the brass swords that swung his way, he couldn't even if he'd wanted to, as his weapon was still lodged tight and dangling from the pitted rock, he fell backward, bending at the waist. The blades hissed over his head in less than the blink of an eye. 2 of them. 4. 6. Death reached up, balanced at a backward angle that even he could not hold for long, and snagged the 4th wrist on each of the 2 constructs as they passed. He gave each a solid tug, crossing his arms over his chest, and sank each blade into the torso of the opposite construct. They both froze, the animating magics trying to cope with the sudden damage. While those wounds alone might not, perhaps, have proved sufficient to destroy the creatures, the crossed arms provided enough leverage for Death to haul himself upright once more. Then, using only 2 fingers on each hand, he shoved both the metal soldiers at the shoulder and sent them plummeting over the edge as they had done to him. They twisted and spun as they fell, still locked in each other's death wounds, until he could see no further trace of them. He grunted, watching for a long moment after they were gone. Then, as the cliff was clear at last in the immediate vicinity, he called Harvester up from where it hung and continued on his way. The farther he penetrated into the Crowfather's realm, the more numerous the enemy became. But so, too, did the domain's defenses grow more potent. The crows seemed more plentiful than the stars in the night sky, and while most were of a normal build, an occasional deafening cry or the flap of a wall-thick wing suggested avian defenders of truly prodigious size. Winds froze everything in their wake. Lightning spiked and stabbed, a veritable forest of blinding bolts, and the mountains themselves had begun to shake with the crash of falling avalanches and slamming gorges. So yes, the constructs were many, but Death himself was forced to deal with few indeed, and most of those were sufficiently distracted that he had little difficulty in taking them unawares. The horseman ran, crept, climbed. Harvester rose and fell, sometimes a single great scythe, sometimes 2, occasionally some other weapon entirely, and enemy after enemy dropped. Now, not too terribly long after the clash and the protruding spur, Death neared the heart of the matter. Just ahead, almost undetectable, against the natural jagged lines and projections of the canyon walls, a great tower of worked stone jutted from the depths. It rose overhead, impossibly, unreasonably straight and sheer, so that any glance up into the blackened sky felt like a vertiginous drop into infinite depths. Seemingly natural bulges and niches served, to all purposes, as supporting arches, flying buttresses, embedded columns. Patches of ice glistened in what little remained of the light, adding the only sparks of color to what was otherwise a stew of shadowed blacks and rocky grays. Death scrambled down the cliffs, allowing himself to drop a great deal of the way, then bolted for the tower's entrance, a gaping maw of a cave in the rock face, at a dead sprint. The few constructs that stood in his way were clustered together within the hollow, drifting slowly forward, focused on guarding against attacks from before, not behind. Death swept through them without slowing, Harvester cutting them down or hurling them from the edges, and not one managed a single stroke in return. Just inside the cave mouth, a great sculpture of a crow stared impassively at them all from its perch half embedded in the stone. Beyond that lay only shadow and frost. And still no small trek. Death briefly cursed the Crowfather's paranoia and egotism both, and continued. Through frigid corridors so high that he could scarcely see the ceiling, through barren chambers in which the shapes of things long dead were only just visible within the ancient ice, And finally, through a cavern so vast it generated its own currents and winds, the horseman traveled. In that last, he picked his way between jutting rocks and fierce stalagmites, sliding across great sheets of slick frost. Feathers formed a sporadic carpeting, and the entire cavern smelled of guano and, despite the eternal cold, growing things from deep within the earth that no sentient beings of any world had ever seen. He ignored them all, walking until the great pillar at the cavern's center, a column of calcification and ice as thick as a hill, had come and gone, until finally, death came to an open cave mouth at the grotto's end, passed through to the stairs beyond, and began once more to climb. And that will do it for Chapter 6. Hope you enjoyed it. I did. Once again, shout out to Derek Dement. Hope you liked it. And I hope you'll all tune in for Chapter 7 when we catch up with War as he arrives at his destination. Till then, I'm BurningDogFace, and I'll see you on the next episode of Let's Read Darksiders, the Abomination Vault. Later!